With everything panel lined and chipped, it's time to make Big Stompy look dirty. For the environmental weathering, I've gone ahead and assembled some of the major components. I put together the, what would you call this, the waist and the legs, and mounted it on the base. Now it's just snapped on there. The base has actually has recesses for the feet, and they snap in there, and so it allows you to make it look like it's kind of sunk into the earth. So when I'm putting the various effects that I'm going to on the base, I'll actually overlap the feet a little bit. And by having it on the base like this, it's going to be easy to weather and keep all of the environmental effects going in the same direction vertically, so that it just makes sense visually. And then, of course, having the head separate like this just means it's a little easier to hold on to and to move around and to work around. And I can even use this little neck thing here as a grab handle like that. To start off, I want to put some kind of rain streaks down the side. And for this, I'm going to use this Desert Dust model wash from Vallejo. Now, I put 20 drops of that in my palette, and I toned it down just a bit with 1 drop of this dark green wash from Vallejo. Now I've thinned this mix down heavily with water. You can see if I apply some on my hand, it barely even registers. But that's by design, because I can apply quick strokes like that, just flicking my brush up and down on the surface. And right now it seems a little more visible because it's glossy, it's still wet. But as it dries, it will become much more transparent. And the idea here is you just build up layers of this until you get it looking like you want. Now, sometimes I like to think that it would collect a little more down along the bottom of the panels as the water ran down and there was a break right there. So I get a little more of the wash on my brush, and I put it on there fairly heavily like that, just to give me something to work with. Then I touch my brush off on a piece of paper towel to remove the excess, and then I just kind of stipple that around. And again, I do this in multiple layers, building it up until I get the effect that I'm looking for. It's real easy to work with these acrylics this way. They dry really fast, and by using this additive method, you can dial in exactly the look that you're going for. On the roof, I'm going to use a sponge, and I'm going to apply this kind of like I would with chipping, so that it's a more random effect. I don't want it streaked up here. Now, it's kind of heavy right now, but I'll just continue working this around, spreading it out. The sponge will soak some of it back up, and then when I get it about to the point that I think it's looking good, I'll dip my sponge onto a paper towel to clean it off, and then I'll go back and just hit it again to soak up the excess, let that dry, evaluate it, and then do follow-on applications as needed. Here on the waist, I'm going to do the same thing I did on the top of the model, but I'm actually going to leave it on here fairly heavy, because my thinking is when rain and water and dew and all of that roll down the sides and bring the dust and dirt and grime with it, it's going to collect around here. It's not going to necessarily all wash away. So there's going to be a pretty heavy layer of dust along here. So I'm just going to wash that in there fairly heavily to try and sell that notion. Now, all along as I'm doing this, if I think I get it in an area too heavy, like right there, I'll go in and dab it up, clean that up, and then later, if I need to, I can come back with other earth effects or washes or whatever to adjust how it looks. Streaking on the legs is similar to the torso, but what I'm going to do here is go for a little bit more opaque applications of the streak and not have as great a density of them, because if I try to put the same density on the legs as I did the upper body, the head, then it would just be completely dust and there wouldn't be any kind of indication of actual streaks. So here I'm going to do the density a little different so that there's some distinction to sell the notion of dust. Reality is the whole thing would probably be covered in dust, but I don't want to cover up all of the previous effects so that the viewer has something interesting to look at across the model. Now the feet are going to get a fairly heavy amount of this dust wash, this rain marks wash, because obviously they're going to be down in the dirt. They're going to be kicking up the dust. Everything's going to run down onto them. So I want it to be very prominent here on the feet and the lower legs, keeping in mind that the height of a man is about right here. So I'm thinking that the majority of the really heavy dust effects needs to be about half the height of a man. So I'll just bring them up that high in this area. And then I won't just have a straight solid line, but just kind of stipple it around like that to try and get the effect. And there's obviously going to be more earth effects that go over this. So another reason for having this fairly heavy is so that some of that will shine through. Now I want to add some dried mud effect to the feet and lower legs. And the reason I've removed it from the base is I don't need to get this on the base itself, because if you think about it, the ground is not going to really be dried mud. If you've ever played in the mud, you know that moist earth looks one way when it's on the ground, when it's in the earth, you dig it up. But if you dig it up and put it on something to dry out, it generally gets much lighter. So I want to put down a layer first of the lighter mud effect to represent mud that has gotten on here that dried up. Now I'll later go back and put on some wet effects, some darker earth effects lower down on the feet, and then of course once it's back on the base, I'll integrate all of that so that it looks like it's slightly stepping into the weight of it is pushing it into the earth. Now for this I'm using Wilder's light dry mud effect. It's an enamel product, but I'm just going to stipple this on like this, and I want to cover up a lot of that dust, but it's dried out. And when I go back and start blending and toning down this enamel product with some enamel thinner, then some of that dust will start appearing back through there. And I'm only going to bring this up about right here. And then I'll imagine that that's where the actual dried mud is going to stop. But I'll get this on here, let it dry for just a few minutes, and then remove some with some odorless thinner. All right, now that it's dry, or 99% dry, I'm going to use some of this enamel odorless thinner. And again, on both of these products, brand is not much of an issue. They're good products. If you used a different product for your mud, an enamel product or an oil product, that works just fine too. It's not so much the brand as it is the application. Anyway, all I'm going to do is just go through with just a little bit of thinner on my brush, and I'll occasionally wipe it off on this paper towel, and I've just damped it off, and I'm just going to go through and stipple the thinner on just to remove a little bit of that mud. And you can be focused in your removal. It can be along edges or areas where you imagine it might drop off or not collect as much. My main goal in doing this is to uncover some of the previous effects that I've already done so that it doesn't completely hide them. The reality is I I know from experience, when you drive a military vehicle through a lot of mud, it covers everything. It would just be mud up to about here. And it would be wet mud, and then it would be dried mud, in some of the areas. So I don't want to have it completely realistic, because I do want to show hints of the work that's been done before. So I'll just continue stippling it like this, just to blend that in a little bit. All right, I wanted to show a comparison between the one that I've stippled the dried mud effects on, and where I've left it as it is. And you can see I did a light application, so there's still some of this poking through. If you're working on your model and you like the way it looks when you've just put it on there without any blending, leave it that way. There's nothing says that this is right and this is wrong. This is what I'm choosing to do. That's all this is. I want a little more of the stuff poking through, showing the details and the chipping and the other work, whereas this doesn't show it as much. But whichever you like, or if you want to have more or less or something in between, that's fine too. If you're wanting some actual clumped mud, some dried clump mud to show, you could either add a little more of the enamels in certain spots to make them more opaque, which would sell that notion. Or you could add some pigments, especially if they were colored about the same as the enamel effect, or whatever effect you're using. Add some pigments in, and that's going to give it just a little bit of texture when it's done, to sell the notion of some dried mud on the model. Now, in doing that, you can consider scale. Is it out of scale? Is it in scale? But I don't think it's necessary to be strict and absolute all the time about it. There's times when I look at it and I go, would that be out of scale? And my answer may be, yes, that would be out of scale, but I don't care. I want to convey clumpy mud. So, do consider scale, but only to decide if you're going to consider it. Now if you decide, yes, I am going to consider it, then you want to start thinking about, okay, what would look in scale? But, there are no absolutes in modeling, in my opinion, other than you're trying to have fun. That's the absolute. Anyway, this is how they look at this point. I'm going to get this one stippled in and then move on to the wet effect mud. Now I want to add some darker mud effects. So I'm going to use a mix of this European Dust Model Wash and this Brown Splash Mud, both from Vallejo. And the European Earth just kind of thins this down, because this is a little thicker than I want. So this thins it down just a little bit. Takes a little bit of the red away from the color, and will give me a slightly thicker but not yet thick mud look to it. Now, unlike oils and enamels, you can't put the acrylic products on and let them dry and expect. I'm making up words this morning. Expect to get a whole lot of blending time available to you. It just doesn't work that way. So what I do is I tend to work a section at a time, and then get it on, clean my brush off in water, and just do any blending that I want while it's still wet, just to moderate the edge a little bit. You can get some tide marks with this stuff, but the more you work with it, the more you figure out how to mitigate tide marks, and often my preference is to use them to my advantage. So I'll go across and do this on both of the feet and get them to where I want them. And then I'll probably mount it up on the base and start working it into the texture that I'm going to put onto the base. All right, you can see how those look. I gave 3 applications. The first covered most of the foot, the second covered about 2/3, and the last covered about the bottom 1/3. So each successive layer just made it a little more opaque and muddy looking, or dirty looking. Now, it's glossy right now because the brown splash mud is glossy. Wet mud is going to be kind of glossy looking. I don't get too hung up about if stuff is glossy or flat or whatever. If I want it to be different, I put something over it to be different. So my plan here is I'll put it onto the base, start adding material to the base, and then decide how much, if any, of that gloss do I want to take away by just adding a clear matte varnish over it, which I can just brush on. So, you know, if you have a product that you like its overall appearance, but it's glossy or flat and that's not what you want, don't get too worried about it. You can always overcoat it and change it to what you want. So I'm pretty happy with how that turns out. I think once on the base, it's going to sell the notion of muddy feet. All right, I'm going to cover the base in this thick mud from Vallejo. It's the European thick mud. Now, when they call this thick mud, it's thick mud. I actually think it's actually got some actual mud in it. But what I do is I just apply a good chunk of it onto the base. I'm getting some out of the container here. It's quite thick, and I think it's drying out a little bit. But I get it on there, and if it's real thick at first, that's okay, because I just dip my brush in water and just begin spreading it around. And you'll notice that I used a lot of water to do that. And what I'm going to do is just begin building this up, getting it up to the feet. I don't want to get too much up onto the feet, but if some gets up there, I'm okay with that, because I mean, it is a heavy thing walking on, you know, just the open ground. So it's going to sink down into it to a certain degree. So I'm just going to continue putting this on and getting that integrated in. And then before it gets too dry there on the feet, I'll use a smaller brush about like this to just kind of blend that in and get it looking like I want. These little toes, I call them toes, they lift up like that so you can get the earth up underneath them and then push them down on top of it. And that's a place where you want, you know, you can get some mud in there, because you can imagine that would get stuck in there. So let me just go ahead and I'm going to, off camera, work my way around this base and get this all integrated in there, and we'll see how it looks. All right, you can see I've got that applied, and I'll need to give it some time to dry. It was a pretty thick application, so I want to make sure it's good and dry. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to map out some grassy looking areas with this Vallejo dark green model wash. So I just want to map out some areas that are green. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some pigments over it in just a minute that will give it hopefully just a little bit of texture and some variation to the greens. And then I'm going to put in just some tufts of larger grass to represent, you know, weeds and just bigger clumps of grass. And I've mixed in a little bit of green earth pigment with that Vallejo model wash, and it just makes a little bit of a lighter tone, and I'm just going to stipple that around in a few areas just to provide some tonal variation. And it also has, it's going to dry with just the slightest bit of extra texture. Of course, among this other texture, it's not going to stand out that much. Now I'll wet blend some of this dark yellow wash, which has got a slightly different color to it, and I'll mix in a little bit of that pigments. And this is just a very rough wet blend. I'm just going to let it flow through the previous stuff that I've put on there and take advantage of just how it's going to generally just kind of mix through there. And again, this is just to add some tonal variation. I'll use these Midland tufts from Citadel, and with some thinned PVA glue on the backing, I'll just place these around on the base. Alright, I'll let those dry for a while. I've got to head off to work anyway, and then I can finish up this base and we'll just about be finished with the model. Now that everything on the base is dry, I'm going to use some Vallejo dark green model wash, thinned pretty heavily with water, about 1 part of the wash and maybe 3 or 4 parts water, just thinned pretty heavily. I'm just going to go in and I'm going to just work it through these tufts of grass. The grass tufts have a bit of a glossy look to them, a bit of an artificial look. And by putting this green wash on there, this thin green wash, it's going to flatten out the look of, it's not going to be as glossy, and it's going to give it a tone that unifies it more with the base. All right, I think I'm going to call this done. I obviously popped off the front hatches here and the top hatch and replaced them with the open versions, but I didn't glue them in, so whoever eventually hopefully buys this, they can put it in whatever configuration they want. I mounted the guns on, and I just did a little dry brushing on this one to make it look like it was a little had been shooting a little bit. And I may go back later and touch up a few details here or there after I look at it for a few days. I always do that. I'll set a model aside, won't look at it for 3 or 4 days, and then go back and just add a few little touches. But anything I do won't be anything different than what I've already shown. So it's just sometimes just tightening things up a little bit, or finding a bit here or there that I missed. I'm already seeing a couple of them, but that's okay. That's just part of the process. But I hope throughout this series that I've conveyed what a fun kit this is to build. I mean, you don't have to be a Star Wars or a sci-fi fan to enjoy this kit. It's just an absolutely magnificent build, covered in detail, no difficulties in building it at all. Really no seam lines to worry about. Nothing other than you just need some good nub cleanup, and everything just literally falls together. And with even the simplest techniques, you can make this model look just so cool, and it's so iconic. So if you've never built one, get your hands on one of these, because I really think you would enjoy building it. And it can be built by anybody of any age. I wouldn't mind giving this to a 7-year-old or an 8-year-old. I think with just a little bit, if they've never built a model, just a little supervision, they would do fine on it, and they would absolutely enjoy it. So the Bandai Star Wars kits are great, but I think this one and the Snowspeeder are the two that I recommend more than any others. Well, thank you so much for watching this video, especially if you're still hanging around at this point. I'm really grateful for everyone who hangs around to the end of the video. If you have stuck around to the end, why don't you just drop a comment down below that just says Big Stompy, and I'll know what you're talking about. I know why you did it, and you will too, and we can have a good laugh about that. But again, thank you so much for watching. Thank you for your support of this channel. One way you can support this channel is if you just hit that subscribe button right down over here, and click the little bell icon so you'll know when I have new videos out. It also helps me on the videos if you would drop a comment down below and leave it a like. That really helps me grow the channel, and I would be most grateful for that. There's also links down below to Patreon, and there is a join right here on YouTube. There's a link over there for that. If you would like to support the work that I do, then those will give you an avenue to do that, and you can read about the benefits of supporting the work that I do. If you're already a supporter, thank you so much. I'm so grateful for this, for the kindness that you show me and my family to make what I do possible. We just couldn't afford to do it at the pace that I do it, with the materials and so forth that I do it, if it weren't for you. So you definitely make this possible. Thank you very much. And with all that being said, I'll leave you with one final thought. In this hobby, if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.